Welcome back, everyone. This is the Oracle Decodes, the story of Abraham and Isaac, child sacrifice, and daylight savings time. In this piece, we're going to get into some more mind-blowing new information to share, as well as we're going to tie some things together with it that we've seen from previous decodings here. So we're going to start out by heading over to Wikipedia just for some brief information about the mainstream story given about the invention of daylight savings time to start with. Now, I found it to be all more intentional confusion that's being put forward about it, as we're going to see more clearly as we go forward in this piece, and it's because the real knowledge underneath the explanations that were given by the Liar Liar Pants on Fire Secret Drama Society cult members who perform their roles so well to keep covered up. Well, it's done because, at least one of the main reasons, is because knowledge like this starts blowing holes the size of craters through the given heliocentric model of the universe that we're all taught about in school. That's just one example. Now, something else I want to mention here that Wikipedia tells us about the need for the invention of daylight savings time is that in the ancient Roman civilization, they had something called water clocks, and they mentioned that these kept track of time differently depending on what time of year it was. Now remember that we were learning that the ancient Romans had a lot of trouble syncing their calendar to the sky clock or the seasons in reality. And that was what we looked at in the Oracle Eyes, the Timeline Pirates, and discovered what I've been calling the real Oracle or the real all-seeing eye, winks. So in that video, the Oracle Eyes, the Timeline Pirates, we were taking a look at how this phenomenon, what was then new knowledge to the ancient Romans, that caused the switch from the old Julian calendar system to the Gregorian calendar timeline that we're using today. This daylight savings time is just one element of what I am calling overall this wink phenomenon that the real Oracle or the real all-seeing eye does. Now, for certain areas of the Earth that experience differing lengths of daylight hours depending on what time of year it is, this requires the necessity of daylight savings time. We're told that the purpose of this was for farmers, perhaps, to utilize daylight hours more efficiently. Other explanations that were given is that it was all about energy consumption. But as we're getting into this, we're going to find out that even though the Romans, were a bit late to this, discovering this wink phenomenon and having to include daylight savings time, we're learning already that the ancient Egyptians were well aware of it, evidenced by their building of the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids of Egypt. But we're about to see, maybe for the first time, at least I've not seen any other scholar or researcher talk about it in quite this way. This was knowledge that the ancient Jewish astronomers were also aware of, and they encoded this knowledge right in the beginning, in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. So we're going to cue up a screenshot here from Stellarium once again as we start our decoding of the story of Abraham and Isaac from chapter 22 of the book of Genesis in the Bible, and learn how this ties in overall to this wink phenomenon. We're looking again at the same sky story scene that we were looking at when we were decoding the riddle of the Sphinx. So we're looking here at what we commonly call the end of the first week of March, and we're doing it this year, the year of what we commonly call 2020. And we learned when we were decoding the riddle of the Sphinx that it's this time of year, at least in the spring, and again in the opposite time of year in the fall, that the Sphinx actually points us toward. It's when the real Oracle or the real all-seeing eye winks. Now, as we'll see, this is also the real reason why daylight savings time had to be invented, and the story about it was made intentionally confusing. All of this overall ties into what is reconciling what we call the seasonal equinoxes. So that would be the spring equinox and the fall equinox. But we're going to get more in depth into those specific aspects of reconciling the equinoxes with the solstices and still other decoding pieces yet to come. Because as we're going to learn here, this wink has more than one motion to it. This is why it becomes complex or difficult to explain. But we're going to do our best as we continue to take this in bite-sized pieces to make it easier to digest so we can see the bigger picture that much more clearer. So we're going to look at chapter 22 of the book of Genesis in the Bible, specifically at the story of Abraham and Isaac. It's another story we're going to find here that seems to have become a very popular theme. And it's right here at the beginning of this Bible story. It's foreshadowing many other stories that come after it, and I'm sure was patterned about the same theme on many stories that came before it. But the theme is this overall disgusting idea of child sacrifice. It shows up in other times, cultures, and even religions like this one. And we find it here right in the beginning in Genesis, all the way back to ancient Judaism. And this carried through to Christianity, of course, and to where we only briefly touched upon before in our decoding of the Kaaba in Mecca, where the story of Abraham and his other son Ishmael continues on later into the religion that became Islam. These are the three Abrahamic religions, as they are known as today. And at the center of how Abraham became the quote-unquote father of these nations is this story of almost child sacrificing his own son Isaac first. So let's read Genesis chapter 22 and sync it up with the sky story and find out what this, on the surface, what appears to be this horrible story of Abraham and Isaac, what it really means. And it came to pass after these things, God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac. And I'm going to interject here, because remember at this point in the story, Abraham's other son Ishmael hasn't yet been conceived. So Isaac is still yet Abraham's only son. Okay, so chapter 22 in Genesis goes on. Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up, and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to ye. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand, and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Now let's stop here and plug into the sky story the characters that we've already been introduced to here in this story of Abraham and Isaac. It says Abraham rises up in the morning and is looking 3 days ahead, which puts us right here, as you'll see clearly, at the end of what we commonly call the first week of March. Also remember, this is at the same time of year, it's at the beginning of it, that 40-day period of Christians today celebrating the season of Lent or the season of sacrifice, as we've also seen in previous decodings as well. So the sacrifice theme, the same time of year, all in these stories that we're going to see stay consistent, and they have nothing to do with what we've been taught about. Abraham, who God promises, will be the father of nations, the father of these many descendants that all come from him. He is the combination of Taurus the bull, as it's known nowadays, and the constellation of Orion, the man. Orion, the central character in almost every decoding piece we've seen so far. This combination is Abraham. Crowned by the constellation of Auriga, you can see above Orion's head. So you can interpret this as the man that God promised what you can think of as a sort of kingship to. This father of many nations is what God gives to Abraham. The Abrahamic religions, those are the nations of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as they're known today. The ass Abraham saddles for the ride to the top of the mountain in Moriah is the constellation known nowadays as Monoceros, the unicorn, the single-horned horse. Here, Monoceros, or the unicorn, is playing the ass that Orion, as Abraham rides to the top of the mountain. This is also the exact same group that we saw playing out characters in our decoding of Halloween and the legend of Sleepy Hollow. The same combination of Taurus and Orion is Brom Bones, who the author makes sure that we know his real name was Abraham in the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Brom Bones' real name was. He's the one who dresses up like the Headless Horseman, pointing to the opposite time of year that the real oracle or the real all-seeing eye winks. And this is also pointing to the need for what is known as the spring and fall changeovers, daylight savings time, in some parts of the world. The mentioning of Brom's real name being Abraham in the legend of Sleepy Hollow is a nod and a wink by the author encoding this connection between these two times of the year and, obviously, winking at the Abraham and Isaac story. The two men accompanying Abraham on their journey to the top of the mountain are playing the role of Gemini, or the twins, as they're known nowadays in the sky story here. And the claved wood for the burnt offering is encoding for the constellation of Pisces, the two fishes. But you can see as Pisces is at the top of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic, this looks to the storytellers like a log of wood that it's been split in two, right down the middle. And the fire, you can see, is the sun, just about to touch the constellation of Pisces. Or in other words, the fire will be set to the wood in just a bit for the sacrifice on the altar. Isaac is found also at the top of Mount Moriah here in the sky story, as you can see the constellation of what we call nowadays Cetus, the whale. A constellation that's often been imagined by storytellers, even in the ancient past, to look to them like a big baby or a child in the sky, the offspring that's eternally tied to Orion, or Abraham in this story. Cetus is Isaac. The child, Isaac, his father, is about to sacrifice, and Isaac doesn't know it. Isaac asks his father about the lamb that will be offered for the sacrifice, as he sees the fire in the wood but no lamb. And that's because, as you can see, the constellation known nowadays as Capricorn, that could easily look to certain eyes, as you'll see in a minute, by the way that it's shaped, could be a lamb. And it's almost completely descended into the western horizon. Or in other words, it's out of the sight of Isaac at this time, of his questioning Abraham, his father, about the altar of sacrifice that's being set up for him, but he doesn't know it. So we're going forward now to the following day. So we're right at the end of that first week of March, and keep in mind that daylight savings time is a shifting date on the calendar every year. So in the spring, daylight savings time is marked at the second Sunday of March, and it's marked again the first Sunday in November. So this year, it's going to occur on what we commonly call the 7th of March, is marking the end of that first week. As we read on in the story of Abraham and Isaac from Genesis chapter 22, verse 8 now, we'll see how it continues to sync up. And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering." So they went both of them together, and they came to a place which God had told him of. And Abraham built the altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar, upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not one hand on the lad, neither do anything unto him. For now I know thou hearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and behold, behind him a ram with his horns, caught in the thicket. And Abraham took the ram, and offered him for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah-Jireh, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. So let's see how this part of the story plugs in here to the sequence in the sky story that's continuing. So Orion and the combination of Taurus, or Abraham, binds his son Isaac, using the tie of the constellation known nowadays as Eridanus, the river. And Isaac, as Cetus, the whale, is now bound and placed on top of the altar. As you can see, Orion's outstretched arm above his head is holding the knife. The knife is corresponding to the constellation of Aries, the ram. As it's known today, it's found also, you can see, at a point where it's just now crossed that special crossing point of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic, or just starting to. It's at the top of the mountain where Abraham has now raised the knife to kill his own son as commanded by God. So let's pay attention now as we're looking here at all of the characters here on top of the mountain. Again, just take note of Aries, the knife, and where it's located, right as it's just crossing over the special crossing point of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic. Because as you're going to see, we're going to go forward here just the next day in the sky story to when this year, what we commonly call 2020, the mark of daylight savings time happens. This spring wink causes our clocks to go forward an hour as far as the sun is concerned. But remember, when we were looking in the Oracle Eyes, the Timeline Pirates, this has to correspond with what is today a 13-day difference between what was then the Julian calendar and what became the Gregorian calendar. And it was all about this discovery, this collection of phenomenons that I'm calling this wink. So, as we're looking at this next day, what we're looking at here is what's occurring, again, in the spring part of this wink phenomenon. And we can see that when it happens in the spring, even though the clocks spring forward an hour, it causes everything in the sky story that we're looking at to jump back. So you can see that at the beginning of the daylight savings time mark in the spring, the knife, or Aries, has been pulled back from the altar just before Abraham was going to plunge it into Isaac. The angel of God that stopped him corresponds to the constellation of Aquarius, reimagined by the way that it's shaped to be the angel from heaven, especially looking, if you can see, the trail of stars that look like they might be the wings of an angel attached to Aquarius's back. And now visible because of this wink, or the start of daylight savings time, the mark that you're seeing here is just one element overall of this phenomenon that I'm calling the wink. You can now see that the constellation we know today as Capricorn is now visible, and in this story has jumped back above the western horizon at this time and is visible in this screenshot where just the day before it wasn't. So once again, we're finding that the role of the scapegoat Capricorn is playing in this story as well is the lamb that was sacrificed instead of Abraham's son Isaac. Genesis chapter 22, verse 15 continues, "And the angel of the Lord called out to Abraham a second time, and said, By myself I have sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars in heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice." Notice the reference to the stars in heaven and the sand on the shores. We now know from our many decodings that this is a celestial sea reference as well, all pointing us to clues to properly decode this story of almost child sacrifice and how it all ends with the obedient to God. No matter how horrible God's command was to begin with, it was still obedient Abraham who became the father of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim nations known as the Abrahamic religions, didn't he? Now, as we end this piece, let's take, now that we've decoded the binding of Isaac's story, and tie it into the Halloween story that we now know, after decoding the legend of Sleepy Hollow, corresponds to the other side of this wink that the real oracle or the real all-seeing eye does. And it's also the other marking point where you're going to find daylight savings time in the fall. So in this screenshot, we're looking now at the sky story again, and notice it's the same alignment that we're looking at during the first week of March in the sky story of Abraham and Isaac, or the saving of Isaac. And you can see that's just another tie-in with daylight savings time. That is the daytime version. What we're looking at here at Halloween at midnight is the opposite time of year in the fall, and it's the dark version of daylight savings, you can think of it as, where the sun begins to die into the horizon earlier and earlier each day in the northern hemisphere. So the daylight hours have to now be saved by falling back an hour on our clocks here. Now remember from decoding the legend of Sleepy Hollow that the headless horseman loses his head, we're told, in the American Revolutionary War, where he's hit by a cannonball. Even this element of the story is another wink and a nod to what time of year this story really encodes for and its real purpose. So before we tie it in, take a look at the constellation of Cetus the Whale, again at the cross of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic, this time looking like that cannon that shot out the cannonballs, which are the constellation of Pisces. And you can see just one of those cannonballs of Pisces arced just right to make the headless horseman out of Aquarius there when he lost his head. And now we're going to connect this to something we also saw from the beginning when we were looking at the information on Wikipedia when you look up the history of daylight savings time and how this starts to pull things together. It's about Benjamin Franklin, someone known to be what we commonly often hear him called one of the, quote, founding fathers, right, of what we now commonly call America. And with that, of course, goes the whole story of the American Revolutionary War, right? Same war where the headless horseman lost his head in. And then he starts haunting Sleepy Hollow ever since. Wikipedia says Benjamin Franklin published the proverb, "Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise," and published a letter in the Journal de Paris during his time as an American envoy to France, suggesting at that point that Parisians economize on candles by rising earlier to use morning sunlight. This 1784 satire proposed taxing window shutters, rationing candles, and waking the public by ringing church bells and firing cannons at sunrise. Despite common misconception, Wikipedia goes on, Franklin did not actually propose daylight savings time. 18th century Europe did not even keep precise schedules. However, this changed as rail transport and communication networks required a standardization of time unknown in Franklin's day. So even though he didn't invent it, Ben Franklin, one of the founding fathers, was often and still is associated with daylight savings time, so much so that Wikipedia has to put this interesting blurb in to refute the misconception. One more tie back to the Abraham and Isaac story. This baby in the spring, you're also looking here on Halloween at the same scene, right? But it's the fall or the dark version. And it corresponds, you're going to find out, to a very famous lullaby, which is actually also talking about the same wink phenomenon, but yet another element of it. The famous lullaby I'm talking about is something pretty interesting when you think about it, although it's very well known and probably everybody has sung it. Most never realize that it too, this lullaby that you sing to a baby traditionally, is a lullaby all about child sacrifice too. Rockabye Baby. The baby in his cradle is Cetus at the cross of the North-South Meridian Line and the Arc of the Ecliptic. That's the treetop. And the bough of the tree, you can see, is Pisces, as it is there too, looking like the bough or the branches of the tree that's going to break. So rockabye baby on the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. And let's stop there. It does fall, right? Indeed, it falls in the fall. As you can see, the bough of Pisces has broken to the Earth's horizon on Halloween, and the cradle has fallen as well. The song ends with the last line, and down will come baby, cradle and all. And as you can see, it's Cetus that's going down into the horizon of the Earth again. Just like we watched happen to Ichabod Crane in the legend of Sleepy Hollow, remember. I'm actually surprised at this point that the author of the legend of Sleepy Hollow didn't include a flaming jack-o'-lantern at the end that winked. But even without that detail, I think our aim at decoding the real meaning and purpose of these stories and tying them together hit our target head on. And we tied a whole lot together in a short amount of time, so I guess we were saving daylight in the process, and doing it all without ever thinking of encouraging the harm of any child, knowing the real creator would never have encouraged such a thing to begin with. I think that's a good place for us to end at this point, and we're going to pick it back up in our next decoding. But until then, be well.